She is the author of Detroit, Pulitzer Prize finalist, many, many, many awards, also an incredible and well-regarded devised performance artist. It's my pleasure to bring out Lisa D'Amour. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thanks. It's really great to be here.
And Lisa and I saw Detroit last night, so I'm going to just get the big question out of the way first. How'd you like it?
Awesome.
Yeah?
So awesome. Such a great job. It's really a treat to see this play in an intimate theater like this. I think it's kind of designed for it, actually. It becomes a very visceral experience, and the whole team just did such a great job. And as many of you know, my brother is acting in the play. So that was quite an experience to see him playing Kenny. So.
Well, we'll talk a lot about Detroit in a bit. I want to start out by acknowledging something we've been doing the last few years, which is having prominent American female playwrights.
Mm-hmm.
We started with Young Jean Lee, Sarah Ruhl came, Paula Vogel, yourself, and part of the reason I've noticed in a lot of our classes, there are more women than men, and yet so much of the monologues that they're doing, so many of the plays they're reading, are written by white men. And now here I am moderating a talk. And still, I read some report that said that most, well, obviously most, but a really large portion of regional theater is devoted to male playwrights, even though there's so many fabulous female authors. Do you think about that? Do you know why that is? Have you considered it?
You know, I don't wake up every morning thinking about it, but it was it was interesting because we were talking at lunch, Kevin and I, and he pointed out that I'm the only woman in this season, which probably no one noticed. I mean, I don't think I noticed when I looked at the brochure. So it's this interesting phenomenon where you kind of don't notice how underrepresented women writers are. And, you know, I don't have the answer as to why. I think there's a number of things to think about. One is how long it took for women to just feel like they could actually identify as a playwright, you know? I mean, it was, you know, I'm thinking about like Susan Glaspell, who was a playwright around the time of Eugene O'Neill's time. But other than Susan Glaspell, I can't think of many other women playwrights at that time. So, you know, in terms of the canon, there's fewer women writers. And then in terms of what regional theaters produce, often they're not always producing new plays. So they're looking to the canon, which is filled with men. So I do think that we're catching up in the world that I walk in the cities I work and live in, which is Austin, New Orleans, Minneapolis, New York. It's bursting with women playwrights, really amazing women playwrights, many of whom are starting their own theater companies. So I do see a change happening, but I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure why it's taking so long.
Well, you'd mentioned, and I don't think we're going to figure out all the reasons today, but you'd mentioned what I'd read about at the TCG Conference last year. Some controversial. We should bring it up. Let's make this controversial right now.
Well, so I mean, it's connected. It's related. So I was talking to an artistic director about a roundtable that happened. It was a roundtable discussion at the Theater Communications Group Conference. And there was a very radical proposition that any white man that has been running a theater for more than 10 years should step down and hand his job over to a person of color, was the radical proposition. The point being, you know, you're programming from the position of white male privilege. That's a very hard mindset to get out of. I think there's been great progress by many people of many genders and many colors in that area. But what would happen if suddenly the point of view completely switched? And I was talking about it with a white male artistic director, and it was very difficult for him. I mean, he literally blushed and was kind of talking about it. I've worked so hard to start this theater, and why should all of this work suddenly, you know, kind of just like not be acknowledged anymore? And so it's a very personal conversation to the people who are running these theaters. And obviously it was a question that was trying to provoke. But it's interesting to think about the point of view that's creating this culture. Yeah. So.
We talked also a little bit, and you had some thoughts on this, about whether or not, and I'm gonna mangle this a little bit, but whether or not you see in your work a feminine through line or something that identifies it as a woman's voice. And we sort of discussed that, and it's kind of difficult to even describe it that way, isn't it? Well,
I was telling Kevin that if you've seen Detroit or when you see Detroit, there are two really strong female characters in the play. And when I wrote it, I didn't even realize how much they kind of take over the play in a way. And Austin Pendleton, who directed the premiere production at Steppenwolf, was the first person to really point that out to me. And you know, it must have been intentional in writing it because I wrote it and it happened. But it was more intuitive, I would say, that I was giving voice to these women. And a lot of times, I think, and you see in many of the plays that I write, this urge to kind of allow underrepresented people speak, and speak in a way that is honest and not necessarily cleaned up and pretty. In my latest play, Airline Highway, is set in a crumbling motel on a road called Airline Highway in New Orleans, which is my hometown. And it's about a group of people who are renting rooms there by the week. They're in various professions, legal and illegal, in the French Quarter. And one of their dear friends, a woman named Miss Ruby, who is an elderly burlesque performer, has requested a funeral before she dies. And so the play is this group of kind of dysfunctional, living on the edge people pulling together as a family to throw a living funeral for their mom, in a way, because they don't really have great relationships with their families. And I'm very interested in just allowing this world to kind of exist in a way on stage and giving these people voice. And I don't know if that's particularly feminine or if that's the woman in me, you know, wanting to give voice to people that aren't usually heard.
Right.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, there's also a sense, it seems to me, and I just saw Detroit, we turned to Detroit a little bit.
Okay.
Of a sort of a bacchanal, and I wonder if we're not going to give away the end of the play for those of you who are going to see it today, but there is that sort of overt sexuality that's sort of going on,
bubbling up.
Where does that come from? I mean, you've talked about New Orleans being so important in the way that you write. Do you think that's an influence?
The city itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, you know, New Orleans is a very Catholic city, and I was raised Catholic, like deep in the rituals of the Catholic Church. So there's a ceremonial. I feel like there's often a sense of ritual and ceremony in my plays, and then of course, you know, it's a very religious city, and it's also the home of Mardi Gras, which is a religious ritual. It's Fat Tuesday. It's the day that happens 40 days before Easter. It's your last chance to eat, drink, and indulge before 40 days of fasting. And I think it's also a day where many people in the city put on masks. And, you know, there's a theory that, you know, putting on the mask reveals the true self or reveals another self that maybe you can't always have on display when you're walking through your everyday world trying to hold it all together. So I do think that in Detroit, you really experience some characters becoming unmasked or maybe revealing the mask of their true self. And, you know, I feel like that sense of discovery through celebrating is something that I've experienced a lot in New Orleans, and I think shows up in a lot of my plays. So is that kind of what you were
absolutely.
looking for?
And I think, and we'll circle back to some of these things as well. Say a bit more about where Detroit came from, this play. Watching it last night, it's very clear that it's not really specific to Detroit. And tell us a bit about that. It doesn't have to be set in Detroit. It's just the name of the play. Is that right?
Yeah. When I started writing Detroit, it felt very much like a suburban fable to me. And I wasn't really thinking of any particular suburb. And I wasn't even sure if the characters were like real-life people. I was thinking, what I really wanted to do was put two very different types next to each other. Two different types of people who kind of needed each other at that moment. The title dropped in about halfway through the writing process. And I believe that it dropped in because I titled it very much as an outsider, because I think the title is about the anxiety that the name of that city evokes in the larger American public, whether that has to do with the death of industry or the death of whatever this elusive American dream is. Detroit has to It sort of like has had a lot of metaphorical weight put on it. Poor Detroit. So that's kind of where I was coming from when I titled it, and I don't think actually the play is like particular to Detroit. When there was a production of the play in Detroit that I was involved in, I allowed them to change all the references in the play so they were Detroit specific, and that's the only time the play has been kind of Detroit specific. So, but you know, I was really interested in. You know, I was interested. I'm very influenced by the world that my plays happen in. So, you know, early on, I knew there was going to be two houses that looked a lot alike because they were kind of designed from the same model, and one was really kept up well, and one was empty and had been foreclosed on. And I was very interested in this kind of foreclosure phenomenon that was very present in 2009, of, you know, neighborhoods suddenly, houses just going vacant, you know, because people had lost their mortgage. So I kind of knew that was the setup, and then I kind of imagined what these two different couples might be like, and then I just kind of started. I never really know where my plays are going when I begin. I'm not a writer that maps out the story ahead of time. And I think you almost feel that when you watch Detroit. You're kind of like, whoa, where is this going next? And that was a little bit of my experience of writing it, to be honest. So.
But it seems, and it's obviously very relevant that you wrote it in 2009, and obviously you see the economic overtones all over it. But it's more than that, especially as the economy maybe slowly gets back to better. It's still deeply relevant. The first play I compared it to in my mind was Death of a Salesman. It's more than just economics. It's Can you speak to that? Is it the loss of the American dream, or what are some of the other themes that you're grappling with in this play?
Well, I mean, I think I might be grappling with, maybe it's more like American fear, and how fear can kind of drive you into a very small set of life choices. And I feel like there are people in my life who, you know, kind of maybe got on a path out of high school that they thought was kind of like the right path, or how they were supposed to live their life, and they made choices very quickly, and often out of fear of not having enough money. Do you know what I mean? Like this terrible fear of oh no, I'm not going to have security. If I don't make these choices, my life is not going to be secure. And then suddenly, like, the sort of vast possibilities of who they might want to be, or the kind of life they might be able to live, suddenly gets very narrowed down. And then it's almost like those possibilities disappear. It's like you don't see them anymore, even though, like, they might be right here and right here. So I was very interested in characters that, you know, I think I'm interested in, you know, what does it mean when you reach a moment in your life where suddenly all of these possibilities start to almost burst out of you again because you've been repressing them for so long. How can you be a creative American and be part of inventing the American dream rather than conforming to the American dream? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to the New Orleans influence and the rebirth in the Bacchanal, or finding the reverse in yourself. But there's something else that's relevant to this point, and many of you read the propaganda article that I thought was great that Murray wrote about language,
bad words,
about the F-bomb. I think it happens 38 times in this play, something like that, or a few more.
My mom saw it.
Yeah.
She survived.
Well, we've had a few conversations about this, and I do think it's relevant because I don't know that I would have noticed it had I not read the article. But then again, I watch a lot of HBO, and I'm around students all day, and I use them occasionally too, a lot. But it is something that was necessary to talk about. And you see their signs out in the lobby, you know, strong language, strong content. So I thought, well, we might as well ask the author. I mean, how much of that do you consider? How much do you listen to how people are talking? How do you use, for lack of a better way of putting it, sort of shock words in a conscious way?
Well, it really depends on the play and the world that I'm writing. And in Detroit, you know, there's, in the first scene, actually both of the women curse in the first scene once. And one of them curses and says, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm really trying to work on my language." And the other one, kind of in a moment of being really mad at her husband, says the F word, but she kind of whispers it and apologizes. So there's a sort of, I lay out like everyone's trying to kind of hold in their frustration and not use bad words and be polite. And as the play goes on, that changes. And I feel like in Detroit, these characters are grappling with some things that are beyond language. They're grappling with sexual urges. They're grappling with life choices. They're grappling with things that they don't understand about how they got to this point in their life. And so for me, the F-bombs start flying when you just feel like you can't articulate yourself anymore. So I feel like, and then the interesting thing with this production, and I think there's no turning back, is that my brother layered in like 4 more of them. I was like, I didn't write that, Todd. So I feel like in this theater, which is maybe even more conscious about bad words, there's even more of them in Detroit than there should be. So, but I do think it's about like reaching a point of frustration where, the polite confines of language just breaks down.
Right.
So,
tell us a little bit, and when we turn this over to audience questions, which we will in a few minutes, we'll come back to Detroit, I'm sure. But tell us a little bit more about what you're working on currently and what's going on in the future, because there's a lot of exciting stuff coming up for you.
Yeah, there's a lot happening. Would you like the regional theater world or the devised theater world?
I would like the
first?
Regional theater world, because I have a whole series of devised questions.
Devised theater world, yes. I walk in 2 worlds. So, the 2 big projects that I'm working on now is Airline Highway, which I just described to you, which is a play that's running at Steppenwolf Theatre in Chicago right now. It will close in a few weeks, and then I'm actually doing some rewrites on it right now, and it will, the whole production, the set, the cast, everything will move to New York, to Manhattan Theatre Club's Broadway stage, and it will open in April. So that's a really great experience. The director is Joe Montello, who directed the musical Wicked. So he's, in general, used to directing large landscape plays, which is great because Airline Highway has 9 main characters and like 7 extras. So you don't get to, it's a real pleasure to actually get that kind of a play produced nowadays. So that's been a really wild and wonderful ride. And the opportunity to do a full production of a play and then do rewrites before another one is a really rare and wonderful thing for a playwright, because you don't really learn about what the play is until it's in all of its 3D glory. So that's very much on my mind right now. And then on Monday, I'm flying to Washington, D.C. to work with a theater called Woolly Mammoth in Washington, D.C., which is an amazing theater that produces a lot of new work. And they're producing a play of mine called Cherokee, which I wrote as a companion piece to Detroit. For those of you who saw Detroit, you know how the 2 women are always trying to go camping, and it doesn't really work out. Well, Cherokee is my camping play. So it's another 2-couple play. It's about 2 couples from Houston, Texas, who one black, one white, who go on a big camping trip in Cherokee, North Carolina, which is the home of the Eastern Band Cherokee. And it's kind of about 2 couples going camping in search of transformation. So it's all set in the campground. So
with Airline Highway, I just want to focus on that a little bit. It's a 9 principal play, which is so rare to get produced. I was talking to John Jory last summer for an article I was working on. He founded the Humana Festival, and one of the things he said, Humana Festival for new plays, a great new play festival in the United States. And one of the things that he said he lamented in American playwriting was, because of the increasing costs of actor salaries, of what regional theaters can spend, playwrights are being pressured into writing small plays that can actually be produced. This play's 4 characters mainly, 1 extra one.
And mostly small plays with white people. Small
plays with white. Do you feel that pressure? I mean, how does that... He's talking as an artistic director, but from a playwright standpoint, how do you approach that?
Well, I'm an unusual... my career has followed a really unusual path, so I didn't spend a ton of time thinking about that. But then again, it was a sort of surprise. I was like, why Detroit? I was like, why is Detroit the one that finally people started to produce? And I was like, oh no, 5 white people. That's why. I mean, it's not exactly why. I think it's a really good play, but it's just, I do feel like the cast size and the fact that it could be cast in like a 30-year-old range for most of the parts was part of it. And I actually think that Cherokee, which is 2 white people, 2 black people, and 1 Native American actor that I insist is cast with a Native American actor, it will be produced less simply because of that cast breakdown. And again, it's like, it's hard to really talk about without going to a sort of scary place, you know what I mean, about stories that people want to see. It's about how our country's demographics are changing. It's about a lot. It's about a lot, you know.
Well, if Cherokee is your current play, maybe you aren't feeling the pressure, but have you ever felt the pressure if you really want a play produced, you're going to have to subscribe to some certain cast, makeup, looks, and if not gender, race, at least size.
I do know this, that when I wrote Detroit, the play I had written before it was a play that had a cast of like 11. It was a big play set in New York City, and there was a lot of interest in it, and it never got produced. And I do remember thinking, I am going to write something with a smaller cast size when I wrote Detroit.
How do you think generally, you've worked at some of the greatest theaters in this country and can continue to, in your career, could you talk generally about the way you've seen regional theater develop? Do you feel proud of the American regional theater? In what ways do you think it needs to improve? What are the things it's doing really well?
It's at a really interesting moment right now, I think, because I think that, you know, a lot of the theaters, I mean, what's awesome about this theater is its size. It's so great. It gives you guys so much freedom, you know, to experiment, and I think it's really wonderful, because I think a lot of the crisis in regional theaters throughout the country, most of which I haven't worked in, is that the theaters are so huge. They're just so huge, and so in order to be able to try and sell all those tickets, suddenly you have to find a play that's going to have an incredibly broad appeal, you know, and there's just so much pressure on that. But what I'm seeing is that I think that a lot of the regional theaters are starting to find ways to bring in more experimental collaborative work as much as they can. I'm seeing that in certain stages at Steppenwolf, at Woolly Mammoth for sure. So they're kind of trying to start to bring in plays that maybe don't start from a traditional story. Do you know what I mean? That may involve music, that may involve dance. And I really see regional theaters opening up to that. And I also see a lot of regional theaters, and this is mostly through the support of this amazing foundation called the Mellon Foundation, trying to work with the idea of a resident playwright, where they actually pay a playwright to be in residence for a whole year and develop a relationship with that playwright, who can then develop a relationship with the specific audience that is coming to that theater and write for that audience. And I think that's another thing that regional theaters are really realizing, is that, you know, what is the idea of a local audience? Like, we are a giant country, and there are really different concerns in Colorado Springs than there are in San Francisco. And what does that mean to kind of like really think about what are the stories that our audiences need to hear right now? And those conversations are happening all over the place in regional theater, which is great.
You mentioned sort of, I don't know, experimental work or creative work, and that kind of segues into what I also wanted to talk about, which is, and on the back of the sheet I handed you, and I forgot to grab one for myself. Does anyone have an extra? Thank you. I included some photographs of some of your devised work. I throw around devised work too often because it's something I do a lot here with our students. What is devised work? What does it mean to you? Could you tell us a little bit about Pearl d'Amour and this other side of your theatrical expertise?
And I feel like calling it devised work is, what would you say, 6 years old? I feel.
Yeah, maybe.
In the U.S., yeah. It's kind of a new word that's been it's not a new word maybe in Western Europe, but it's kind of new for the U.S. But, I mean, I think what Kevin's talking about is work that starts from a different place rather than a playwright writing a play by herself, giving it to a director who then gathers a cast of actors, and it's all about kind of serving the story of that play. So with the work that I do with Pearl d'Amour, we usually start with an idea that we want to explore. For example, after Katrina, I was very haunted by these 100 trees that were knocked down on this family property that my family co-owned north of Lake Pontchartrain. And Katie and I, my collaborator, a lot of the work that we do is either outside of theaters or we treat the theater space in a really different way. And I kept telling Katie that I was haunted by these trees, and she said, wouldn't it be amazing if we could just rebuild those trees on stage and kind of bring them back to life? And I was like, that would be really amazing. And we just kind of started together thinking about how to do that and how that could be a theatrical experience. We also really enjoy bringing in people from another discipline to work with us, so we brought in an installation artist named Sean Hall to help us figure this out. And the piece that we wound up developing is an 8-hour performance that begins with a completely bare stage, and the audience can come in at any time during the 8 hours, and we begin with these 7 builders slowly building this forest out of ropes and pulleys and fabric and found objects. You're greeted when you come into the theater by a ranger who kind of tells you a little bit about what we're doing and gives you a map of the forest that tracks every material that we've used to make it back to the earth. And then you can go up on stage with us at any time during the build while this forest is kind of materializing around you. It's a very quiet experience. There's no words until the disassembly, because the building takes 6.5 hours. The forest is complete for a half an hour, and we take the whole thing down in 1 hour. So it's very it's almost like in the building process we're part of the forest, and in the taking down we're like people taking down the forest. And so it's an unusual time frame. It's an unusual melding of the minds, and it's pushing your idea of what theater is and can be. So I think devised theater is really trying to kind of break out of a lot of the traditional ways of thinking about how long a theater performance is, who's performing it, how long can you stay.
How do you, in your work, how does text enter into the devised work? You are nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for a play that's very textual, and yet it sounds like How to Build a Forest isn't at all.
Yeah.
Or is it?
Well, it isn't. The text works in a lot of different ways in Pearl Demore works, but it was interesting. I had to we developed this piece for 2 or 3 years before it was ready, and I probably wrote 80 pages of text that I thought was going to somehow be in. I wrote scenes about the forest. I wrote scenes with old women sowing a forest. I wrote scenes about my family. I was like, I'm a playwright. I have to have words in here somewhere. And I would just bring it in, and we'd like try to do it while we were building the forest. And just at some point, I had to go, you know what? The story is these trees being built. And what we actually did, and this is so funny, I think it's beautiful, but it's like funny that this is where the words wound up, is that when you're sitting in the audience watching the forest being built, every now and then like 7 performers kind of might gather around you and start whispering text that you may or may not hear, and then they disappear throughout the whole performance. And so that's about as far as we could go with words on that one.
I was so taken with some of the images of swimming cities from the Switchback Sea. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that actually does have a more of a, in some ways, a conventional sort of structure. But so a friend of mine who's a visual artist who goes by the name of Swoon, she's a very well-known, she got known first as kind of a street artist. She makes these amazing wheat paste cutouts of people and pastes them on buildings. But then she's also gotten more into sculpture, and she designed and with a group of her friends built these 7 vessels, actual boats that can float out of found materials and junk, basically. They were built in New York, finished in Troy. They were built in New York City, finished in Troy, and then these 7 fantastic boats traveled from Troy all the way down to Manhattan. And what she wanted to do was stop in every small port along the way and pull the boats together and make them into a stage that a show would happen on. So I wrote the show. And the tricky thing was the performers were the people that were working on and living on these boats. And they were visual artists, they were street kids, like it was a real ragtag group. And also I was never quite sure like who was going to be there when. And I was like, well, I could try and bring in actors to do this show, but that's not of the world. So what I wound up doing was I created this script that was basically 7 monologues of people that were living on these boats, the kind of frames that they're living on these boats, and it was 7 different origin stories of how the boats came to be. And these origin stories were linked together by an almost silent narrative about a newcomer who had joined the ship and was kind of being initiated. And then all of the parts were linked together by music from a band named Dark, 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 who had these their accordion, guitar, stand-up bass, and I can't remember the other instrument, but their music flowed throughout. So it was great. It was wild. It was.
How long did this take? How long was the performance or the process?
The performance was about an hour 15 minutes long, but we performed it maybe 6 or 7 times over the course of the journey.
And how long was the journey moving down the river?
I think it took us, I think it was maybe 2 weeks, maybe a little less, but it's not that far from Troy.
Right.
But I got to be on the boats when we went around the tip of Manhattan. It was so amazing. It was really amazing.
Say a little bit, because I know it's one of your more famous pieces, Nita and Zita, and how that came about.
Just really quickly, Nita and Zita is a New Orleans piece, and it is about 2 real-life sisters who were burlesque dancers in the 30s and 40s. They were originally from Hungary, and they emigrated to the U.S. in the 40s, kind of did their sister act, which was kind of a combination of burlesque and contortionism, in vaudeville houses and on cruise ships, and they settled in New Orleans in their 50s when they were kind of, not performing as much, and lived there together in the same house until they died in their 80s. And in their neighborhood, they were known as the Gypsy Ladies, and they would dress in these really fabulous outfits that they kind of made themselves, and they would push their little grocery cart to the store, and they also became known because they started painting the inside and outside of their house with all of these bright polka dots, and every room was like a different. So they were kind of like outsider artists as well as performers. When they finally passed away, and this is a very short version of this story, their next door neighbor, in this very weird New Orleans way, got the rights to their estate. And she went in, and the house was just filled with hundreds of handmade showgirl costumes, of pictures of their showgirl days hanging on the walls, dolls, furniture that they had painted. And she just kind of made their house almost like a living garage sale. And she started selling their stuff out of their house, and all of these vintage store clothing people came and were selling these like amazing costumes. And as this material went out into the world, stories started to circulate about them too, about like they weren't sisters, they were actually lovers that were living together in disguise, which I found it was absolutely not true. There's just like all of these different crazy stories about who they were. And so the play was our attempt to figure out who they were and to celebrate them a little bit. And so the structure of the play is it's an interview with their ghosts. But you don't know they're ghosts until about halfway through the play. And they do a bunch of burlesque dances that we have reimagined. And you kind of get the feeling by the end of the play, which is what we felt, which is that these 2 artists have reached from beyond the grave to grab these performers and so that they can be back on stage. That these performers are channeling them. And we really, I have to say, we felt completely possessed by these women by the end. We were like, they're in control. They want to be on stage. We know as much about them as they want us to know. And so we're just honoring them. And we toured that piece for 3 or 4 years, and it was really magical. A lot of the sets and costumes were lost in Katrina, actually. They were in a storage unit. But we're thinking about reimagining it. We'd like to do it again.
Well, of course, I love Detroit. I think it's one of my favorite pieces I've seen here in a while. I'll just say, and I've directed a few in the last couple of years, and I like this one a lot.
Thank you.
So I hope you all will as well. But I find myself, when I was going through some of these photographs that I included, I just want to see those. I love devised work. Mm-hmm. And we teach a devised course class here. We bring in devised artists. I'm happy to hear you say that you see it happening more and more at the regional level, but traditional plays are still the norm. Yeah. TheatreWorks did a Ludlow this year, which was a devised piece about a local mining disaster. And it's still tough, right? I mean, it's still tough for audiences to accept something that is out of a sort of a traditional mold. Actually, Ludlow was quite popular, to be perfectly frank. But do you see resistance in a different way for the work that you do with Pearl de Moore, or are you preaching to a different crowd, if you will?
The Pearl de Moore work has been a little bit of a different audience, because I feel like there's sort of these two worlds. There's the regional theater world, and then a world that's more made up of museums that have performance spaces with performance curators. I don't know if there's one like that here. I'm trying to think of like the Wexner in Ohio or the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And there's a whole circuit of touring more experimental work, both from the United States and from Europe especially. And so when I make a Pearl de Moore piece, what I know is I have to raise the money. So the first thing we start doing is writing grants, and most of our work has been funded by a grant maker named MAP, the Multi-Arts Production Fund. So, we write grants, we have our Kickstarter campaigns, and then we start developing the work on our own, and then we start reaching out to different presenters, which is these curators who might help us premiere the work. And then usually the presenter will give you a small commission, which is but it's very built kind of from the ground up by the artist. And it's hard. I mean, raising the money is hard, finding the place to develop the work is hard. And what I find is that I actually work in both worlds, and usually you work in one or the other, and the worlds really don't talk to each other a whole lot. The artistic directors of the regional theaters don't even quite know what's going on in the museum houses, often in their own city. It's partially just because it's really hard to run a regional theater, and it's really hard to run a presenting house, and so you're very busy with that kind of work. So it's been weird. I almost feel like one career hasn't really helped the other. It feels like two parallel careers. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's nice to see that they do overlap occasionally. But I mean, it's worth saying that TheaterWorks doing something like Ludlow is extraordinary.
It's huge.
Because it is so hard to do devised work. Some companies will spend 6 years, and obviously that's not a sustainable model. But it's neat to see it. I want to open it up to other questions. As you're, so if we could have house lights, I guess they are on. I'm just under these bright lights. If there are questions, we'll come right up here. I have to ask while I'm walking up here to say the Joe Chaiken quote that we were talking about today at lunch. It's so great and speaks to devised work.
It speaks to Joe Chaiken was an acting teacher and a performer in New York in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And he said, we walk through the world, the way he says it, in a constant state of astonishment, being bombarded by ideas and impulses and choices and fear, and that the only way we survive is by screening out about 90% of it and holding on to the 10% that we know. And his quote was that the actor's job is to try and access all of it, to try and access this unknown, to see if we can wake up audiences to new ways of thinking, feeling, being in the world. So I find myself very inspired by that quote in all of my work, but maybe especially in my devised work, which, Katie and I are always asking impossible questions and creating impossible projects that we know might fail. And reaching towards the failure is actually really important because it's where you might stumble into something really new. So it's very counterintuitive.
I think it's in all your work, Lisa. I think I saw it. The reason I wanted you to say it is because I see it in Detroit, and I hope you think about that quote when you see in Detroit, because I think in that last 10 or 15 minutes, you're seeing...
Yeah, they're opening up.
They're accessing some of the 90%.
Lisa, I assume you didn't just wake up one morning and decide to be a playwright. Did you get started by writing fiction?
Other than like poetry when I was young, playwriting was pretty much my first thing. I got the theater bug in high school, and then really dove in. I went to Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, which is a small liberal arts college, and it was such a small department that we had to do everything. I acted, I designed lights, I stage managed, but we didn't have any playwriting teachers. And so when I graduated, I got an internship at this place called the O'Neill Center, which is in Connecticut. And every summer they have a really amazing Playwrights conference. It's a competition, and in the end, 10 professional playwrights, or maybe 8, get to go there to develop their work. And I was an intern, I think collecting props or something. And but it was the first time that I was able to see living playwrights who were making their life writing. Like, I just didn't have a model for it because I grew up in New Orleans. There wasn't a huge, I was on the dance team in high school, but, there wasn't a lot of arts curriculum where I went to school. So, and I was like, oh, like playwriting can be a profession. And this is how you do it. You write, you go to these conferences, you submit to these competitions. And I came home from that experience to New Orleans completely on fire. And I was really lucky that this amazing woman named Julie Hebert was running the Contemporary Arts Center at the time. And she's a playwright and director. And she had a writers group that I was able to join and go like once a month and be with other writers and we would read each other our work. And again, if that structure hadn't been there, I don't know if I would have been able to keep writing. So it was kind of in that time in college when I really dove in.
We've heard that you've premiered at least a couple of your plays at the Steppenwolf Theatre. Mm-hmm. That's pretty impressive.
Yes, thank you.
How did that come to pass?
Right before, a really dear friend and colleague of mine named Polly Carl, who now she's the editor of a great theater blog called Howl Round, that's based out of Arts Emerson. She was working at Steppenwolf at the time, and she was a big advocate. She had been an advocate of my work for years. And she read Detroit, and she was like, this is a great play for actors. Lisa is mostly an experimental playwright, but this is a play that Steppenwolf might look at. And so she handed it over to the literary department. So it was really kind of having an advocate in that theater. And also, a theater career is so serendipitous. You never can tell what is going to be the door that's going to open to your next opportunity. So, Polly and I had worked on many projects for 15 years that were quite small and, didn't get famous. But by maintaining that relationship over time, it was able to kind of like get me in the door somewhere that's, been an amazing part of my career.
And Steppenwolf has a tradition of embracing experimental work, I think, notwithstanding your comment earlier that this is a relatively new phenomenon in regional theater. It's also interesting to hear you speak of Steppenwolf as regional theater. I'm a former Chicagoan, and so I know the theater, and it doesn't seem quite to fit in that category. But
does it seem very local to you? Is that what you mean?
Well, no. I think they've certainly won a much larger stage with a lot of their work going to New York.
Yeah, I mean, that's been kind of recent, though, in there. Steppenwolf is such a great story because they started out as a tiny storefront theater, with an ensemble of actors, and they stay really, really true to their ensemble. They try to get as many of their ensemble into each play as possible. But it's true, they've become a big national player. But in my mind, that's sort of in the last maybe 10 years, I think. But still, it's an awesome organization.
But do you think, is it fair for me to say the lesson is to become a national player, you have to focus on the local first to grow up. And then the model of trying to mimic what's happening in New York or on the coast is not the way it actually works. If you really want to make it, you figure out what's going on locally. Yeah. Other questions?
As a female playwright, have you had any backlash or trouble getting in because of your gender?
I don't know. I haven't felt it, but it's been surprising when the New York Times, I knew the New York Times was going to announce the Broadway performance of Airline Highway. And then when I clicked on the article, the whole article was about like a woman playwright on Broadway, and they kept saying this weird thing where there hasn't been a woman playwright on Broadway since 2013, and I was like, isn't that last year? It was really weird. But like at that moment, I realized I was like, oh wow, like I'm kind of representing my gender here, and it was a little overwhelming at first. But I haven't felt a bias. I haven't felt like I've ever been beat out unfairly by a male playwright. I feel like I've forged really great relationships with collaborators on many levels, whether it's a director or someone who works at a playwrights center that then moves on to other jobs. So You know, I think that there's a way to really move through this field, you know, knowing that you have a voice that is worth being heard and being true to your collaborators and just moving forward. So you can't get too overwhelmed by the politics of it all.
Other questions come up here. While I'm walking up, you know, you mentioned reading about yourself. As an author, how much do you read about what critics think of your work? I mean, Detroit obviously got great reviews. You know, others, I'm sure, I've read all of your reviews, aren't as good. Do you mind the critics? Do you take that to heart? You obviously read the stuff.
In general, I don't read it, because I feel like if you believe the good ones, you have to believe the bad ones. So that's my brother right there. Wave. He knows. Todd knows my opinion on reviews. My family's always sending me reviews, and I'm like, don't send me reviews. But what I do, though, often, and this is the way I worked it for Airline Highway, I didn't read any of the reviews, but the director read them all, because he's more experienced and more thick-skinned than I am. And he kind of like pulled out certain through lines of what people were discussing, things that maybe people weren't getting. And so we've kind of discussed it that way. So I think they can be valuable, but you know, I think that mostly you have to really stay true to your own vision, you know, and trust that. Mm-hmm.
To tag onto the Steppenwolf question that he asked a second ago, both times that you had your plays produced there, you've had really great directors on them, Austin Pendleton and Joe Mantello. Could you talk? I mean, I don't know how involved you were, like in the room with those.
Very involved.
A lot.
Yes,
cool. So
very
could you
involved.
tell more about working with those two?
Great. Yes. Really great directors and super experienced directors. You know, Austin Pendleton has been an actor and director in theater for, 50 years at least. It was great. It was He is. Austin is an ensemble member, and every member of the Detroit cast was an ensemble member. So that was a really interesting experience because they are really like family. And I was coming in very much as an outsider. You know, I'd never been produced there. And Austin, Joe and Austin have really different styles of directing. And Austin is incredibly laid back and kind of just lets the actors go and discover, and you almost don't feel him directing. And it was interesting. I realized later that was especially an approach he took with the ensemble members because they knew each other so well. So it was great, and I actually felt, as someone who has directed a lot of her own work and had to produce her own work, it was a really interesting experience for me to have to give up control. Because I got into that rehearsal room and I was like, I just have to let them run. Like, they know each other so well. I need to just back away as much as I can. Now, Austin and I would talk and had a great relationship. With Airline Highway, which, you know, that just rehearsed in November, you know, Joe Mantello he's used to directing these large cast plays. He had never directed at Steppenwolf. So in some ways, I was kind of holding his hand in terms of introducing him to Steppenwolf culture. But really, with that, he's such a pro, and also we were doing a lot of rewriting on the script. Detroit was a shorter play and didn't need as much, so you know that was just like every moment of rehearsal, our instincts on high alert, trying to figure out if this word should be cut, if this should be rearranged. So it was really almost like sculpting something together. So it was great. It's a great experience.
I'm a student here, and I should be graduating this semester, and I really love doing devised work and watching devised work. But I'm wondering where to go from here, and how to start. How did you start your devised career as like supported by your more traditional theater career, or
no? I was in graduate school for playwriting, and in Austin in mid-late 90s. And Katie Pearl, my longtime collaborator, who's a director, she moved there to start a theater company in Austin with 3 other people, and that company still exists there. And we met, and we just both knew that we liked to do site-specific work, so work that happens outside of a theater made for a particular place. And we just started talking about something we wanted to do together, and we decided we wanted to make a performance in this grove of trees on the side of this busy street in Austin. And the whole point of the performance was to get people to just slow down and look at this grove that you usually passed by unnoticed. And, you know, I can't remember if we had $75 or not, but we recruited all of our friends, and we it was that was like a 12-hour performance, and I always joke that like 3 hours were brilliant, 3 hours were like, and 6 hours were terrible, you know? But we did it. We did the show, you know? And many of the people that were involved in that show remained collaborators for the rest of my career. So with the devised work, we should talk after. I'd love to get your email. You kind of have to take grand leaps with people that you know and trust. But I have some ideas of like different cities that might be good to go to for devised work. So.
Other questions? I have to. All people are getting there. We have we have time for a couple more. So if there's one more or two more after this.
You spoke earlier about a synchronicity in your life when you were an intern and there was a playwright, and maybe meeting Katie, your collaborator,
Another one,
synchronicity also. Do you find as you write your plays that this is happening to your characters? Do you see synchronicities happening to them?
Do you mean and as I discover them?
As you discover them, yes.
Yeah. You know, writing is most fun for me when I really feel like I'm improvising. And, you know, in many ways, both Detroit and Airline Highway didn't exactly write themselves, but I felt very in the flow of the conversation of all of these characters. And I'll often like realize something that needs to happen with the character, and I'll like jot it down really quickly so I don't forget, and then just keep writing, so I don't you know, lose the groove, I guess. But yeah, I think I know what you mean. If you mean, does it feel like I'm kind of discovering these characters along as they discover themselves, I would say yes, definitely.
I'm interested in your creative process. You say you don't work with an outline. I just wonder how it flows for you.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to put into words. You know, I often start with place, with like the motel in Airline Highway. I spent a long time describing what that set would look like, and then I usually let a few of the characters just start talking to each other, and often what will happen is I'll just start experimenting with the scene. One thing with Airline Highway. I'm almost telling the truth, but I'll let characters start talking to each other, and then like it's almost like I'll see a scene that's going to happen 3 scenes later. I'll like just start to see it, and I'll try and kind of write towards that scene. I don't know how else to describe it. That I'm like writing towards the scene, but I don't know how I'm going to get there. Or I'll like I'll like hear a line and I'll write down that line and try and get to that line. One thing that happened with Airline Highway was the one thing that drives the plot is there's someone from the community whose name is Bait Boy, who left 3 years ago to go live the straight life in Atlanta, and he's come back with his stepdaughter, who's doing a paper for her high school class on subcultures, and so that's kind of like her interviewing all these people, you know, creates a lot of conflict. And when I first started writing the play, what I thought it was going to be was a family from out of town who was coming to Jazz Fest that had accidentally rented a room here on Orbitz. So I thought that was going to be like the outsider, was like, oh, you know, the hotel room you always hope you never accidentally rent on Hotwire, I guess, because Hotwire doesn't tell you what. And so I kind of tried that angle for a while, and it just wasn't working for me. I was like, I can't, this feels too hard to get all the story out. And so then I kind of stopped and started over with this new approach. So that can happen too, where I kind of realize I'm going down the wrong path and maybe reset and start over. So, but it's intuitive. I don't know if it's going to work. I never know if it's going to work. So,
Lisa, I have to end with the question I ask all the playwrights we have out, and that is, who are you reading? What are the playwrights that you really love right now?
Yes.
Who should we know about that we might not?
I wrote a list because I always get asked this question. And then I never have good answers. So I have dead, living, and then kind of up and coming.
Okay, so dead.
Dead, Tennessee Williams, Thornton Wilder. Everybody read Thornton Wilder. Even Our Town is such an amazing play. It's such and his other ones too. Eudora Welty I put on the list. She's a fiction writer, but man, I think she really influenced me as a playwright. She's a Southern woman writer from Mississippi. And August Wilson has been a huge influence.
And a lot. And then, so now we're moving on
Living
to a lot.
is Mac Wellman is a
yeah.
really incredible poet playwright. Anne Washburn, who's a kind of mid-career playwright who's just incredible. Her latest play is called Mr. Burns, and it's kind of inspired by the Mr. Burns on The Simpsons. It's amazing. It's a post-apocalyptic play. Maria Irene Fornez. She's elderly now, but she's a experimental playwright who was very much a part of the kind of Lower East Side and New York scene in the 80s and 90s. Robert O'Hara, keep an eye out for Robert O'Hara, amazing writer-director. His play Booty Candy was just at Playwrights Horizons this season. Really awesome. Carol Churchill is a huge influence on me, a British playwright. Susan Laurie Parks, another amazing woman writer. Erin Courtney is someone you've never heard of, but an amazing poet playwright from New York. And then I just wanted to point out that there's this great trend now. Mac Wellman runs the playwriting program at Brooklyn College, and he's a very experimental playwright, and he encourages all of his writers to go out and start theater companies. And so that's why Young Jean Lee started her theater company. Sybil Kempson is another experimental writer who works a lot with devised companies in New York. She has started her own company. And Tina Satter is a director playwright who started her own company called Half Straddle in New York. And they're all mostly moving in this museum performance world, but they're all really hot stuff. And it's just incredible he's like, if no one's going to produce your work, start your theater company.
That's great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's cool.
So everyone, students, patrons alike, go read those authors.
Great.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be on stage and to talk to you and to share all of your wonderful insights here with TheaterWorks and our students. Thank you, Lisa DeMore.